He never asked why my hands shook. He just watched, and decided it meant I was less. I have been fading for months. Not dramatically. The way old photographs go, color draining so slowly that no one notices until they hold the image up to a window and realize they can see straight through it. He saw every tremor. He saw every morning I pressed my palm flat against the greenhouse wall and waited for the world to stop tilting. He saw all of it, and he laughed, low and deliberate, the way a man laughs when he has already decided you do not matter. Now I am lying here cold, and somewhere out there, he is burning cities to the ground. I keep thinking about the orchids. Whether anyone remembered to leave the threshold light on. If you've ever been called fragile by someone who needed your steadiness more than they could admit, stay. These stories are for you. And if this one finds something true in you, subscribe so the next one finds you too. The ceiling of the infirmary is plaster, cream-colored, with a hairline crack running from the east wall toward the window. I have memorized it. There is not much else to do when your body has decided, without consulting you, to stop cooperating. I drift. That is the only word for it. Not sleep. Sleep has edges. This is more like being held just under the surface of water, light filtering down from above, everything muffled and slow. And what rises up through it are not dreams, exactly. More like the particular memories that a body keeps when the mind has gone quiet. The ones you did not choose to hold, but held anyway.
January.
That is where I keep landing. I came to the Edgewater compound on a Tuesday morning when the lake was frozen 3 inches out from shore, and the sky had that specific Wisconsin gray that is not quite storm and not quite calm, just suspended, waiting. My car was packed with 2 crates of soil amendments, 1 grow light array, and the small notebook I had been keeping since graduate school, its spine cracked and its pages swollen from years of greenhouse humidity.
The orchids were dying.
That was all anyone had told me. I had spent 12 years at the UW, Madison Botanical Conservatory studying plants that live at the edges of survivable conditions, the ones that require precise calibration to thrive, that will not simply grow wherever you put them. Shadow orchids were in a category I had studied but never worked with directly. Extinct in the wild for 2 centuries. Kept alive only in private collections. They had come to me by way of a single phone call, an offer I had been unprepared to refuse, and a car ride through the west side of the city that ended at a gate I had never seen before, on a road I could not locate afterward on any map. The compound was not what I expected. Not a castle, something older and less theatrical than that. A Gothic revival structure built right against the bank of Lake Mendota, its stone darkened with age, its windows deep-set and thick-glazed. The kind of building that does not announce itself. The kind that simply persists. A woman named Dort met me at the service entrance. Thin, somewhere north of 70. With the posture of someone who had spent decades carrying information she was not permitted to share. She did not smile. She led me through a corridor that smelled of iron and old wood and something underneath those, something I could not name, resinous and low, like the air inside a room where candles have been burning for years. She did not explain the court to me. She showed me the greenhouse and left. The orchids were worse than dying. They had the look of plants that had already decided, the leaves translucent at the edges, the roots drawing back from the soil as though trying to escape it. The grow lights the court had installed were wrong, too direct, too constant. Whoever had set them up had given the orchids what they assumed plants needed, uninterrupted brightness. Shadow orchids do not work that way. They live in the threshold, in the precise ratio of dark to light that their original forest canopy provided, a cycle of exposure and withdrawal that no standard grow light setup replicates. They need the shift, not the illumination itself, but the movement between states. I turned the wrong lights off. I recalibrated. I worked through the afternoon and into the early part of the evening, and I did not notice when the quality of the room changed. But it did change. I felt it before anything else, the air, which had been still, pressing slightly differently, the way it does when the atmospheric pressure drops before a storm. Not cold, not warm, dense, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. I kept my hands in the soil. I did not look up. When I finally did, the doorway was empty. I told myself nothing had been there. I was tired. The drive had been long. The light was failing. The greenhouse had old windows that let the wind talk through them in a particular way. I turned back to the orchids. Later, Dort would tell me, without emotion, that the king had inspected every new arrival personally, that he found it efficient to assess threats without announcing himself. She said, threats the way other people say guests. I decided not to ask what the distinction was. The cruelties began on the third day. Not violence. Nothing that obvious. He had been, in 400 years, apparently, precise enough in his destructions that blunt force no longer interested him. He extinguished my workspace candles. I would turn away for the length of time it took to cross the greenhouse and back, and return to find the tapers dark, the waxy smell of extinguished flame hanging in the air. No one admitted to it. No one needed to. There was only one person in that compound who moved without making sound. On the fourth morning, I arrived to find 3 of my recently propagated seedlings gone. Their trays sat empty, the soil disturbed. The faintest trace of ash on the edge of the nearest pot. He was standing in the doorway when I turned around. This was the first time I saw him clearly, not a movement at the edge of my vision, not an inference from changed air pressure, but the full weight of him, standing at the entrance to my workspace in the gray morning light.
Tall.
Still in the specific way that things are still when they have chosen it rather than achieved it. His expression held nothing I knew what to do with. Not contempt, exactly. More like the face of a man assessing something he has already decided is beneath consideration. He looked at my hands. They were shaking, not badly, but visibly, the slight tremor I had been managing for months. He watched that for a moment longer than was necessary. Do humans always do that, he said, or is it a particular talent of yours? He left before I could answer. I stood there for a moment, hands in the air over the empty seedling trays. Then I turned back to the orchids and began again. There was nothing else to do. The orchids needed me, and I was not the kind of woman who walked away from something that needed her, even when the walking away would have been the sensible choice. I noticed, cataloging the damage, that he had taken only the new grafts. The mature plants were untouched. I filed that away and did not examine it. By the end of the first week, the shadow orchids had begun to recover. The first bud came on a Friday night when the lake outside the windows had gone flat and dark. I had my hands in the roots, a habit I developed, pressing my palms into the soil at the base of the most critical plants, feeling for the faint biological warmth that signals a root system still pulling water, still working. Most people would have called it excessive. In 12 years, I had never lost a patient using this method, and I had stopped explaining it to skeptics. The bud was small, closed, still, a tight spiral of deep purple-black, the color of sky just before it goes fully dark. The first one in 3 years, according to the court's records. I did not hear him in the doorway this time either. I knew he was there. My hands stayed in the soil. My eyes stayed on the bud. The orchids survived on the threshold between light and dark. I understood that. I had spent most of my life there myself, in the particular space between being needed and being dismissed, between knowing my own worth and finding no one around me who confirmed it. The threshold was familiar ground. He watched for a long time. I did not look up. When I finally turned, the doorway was empty again. The bud opened 3 days later.
Perfect.
Intact. No one said anything about it. I wrote it in my notebook and went back to work. The bud opened. I wrote it down. I went back to work. That is what I did with things I did not know how to hold. I documented them and kept moving. 12 years of that particular discipline. It had served me well in the conservatory. It served me less well here, where the things I was not examining had a way of accumulating until the weight of them became physical. The tremors had started the previous October. Before the phone call, before the compound, before the orchids, before any of this. I had been repotting a root division at the conservatory, routine work, the kind I could do without thinking when my hands simply stopped cooperating. Not a dramatic failure. More like a signal going intermittent. I set the division down, pressed my palms flat against the workbench, and waited. The tremor passed in under a minute. I finished the repot. I did not write it in the notebook. The clinic on Monroe Street found nothing. Blood work unremarkable. Neurological screening clear. My doctor, a practical woman named Ose, who I had trusted for 6 years, told me to reduce caffeine and monitor my sleep. Stress, she said, with the particular gentleness of someone who has run out of other explanations. Stress does strange things to the body. I reduced the caffeine. The tremors continued. At the compound, they changed character. It was not that they worsened exactly, it was that they arrived differently. Less like interference and more like a withdrawal. The way a tide goes out and leaves the shore altered, depositing things in its retreat that were not there before. By February, I was bracing against walls 3 times a morning. My vision went gauze-edged on the days after I had been in the greenhouse longest. I started keeping crackers in my coat pocket because the dizziness sometimes came with nausea, and eating steadied it, marginally. I became very efficient at not being seen. The greenhouse had 3 structural columns positioned where, if you were standing near the East Orchid table, a casual lean looked like nothing more than a woman pausing to think. I knew the exact angle. I had practiced it. Dort sometimes walked through on her inspection rounds, and I was certain she noticed nothing. The court's other staff, 3 of them, who moved through the compound's public spaces with the eyes-downward precision of people who had learned that noticing things was dangerous, never lingered near the greenhouse at all. He came at unpredictable times. That was the point I understood eventually. Predictability was a form of control he extended only to himself. I could not brace for him, so I learned instead to be already braced. What I did not know then, what no human medicine could have told me because it is not a human thing, is that there is a condition the old courts call anima marcescens, soul wither. It does not begin with the body. It begins with proximity. A living soul, sensitive enough, open enough, the kind of person who presses their palms into soil to feel what is happening beneath the surface, placed in sustained contact with a soul that has been dying for centuries. Not dead.
Dying.
The distinction matters. Dead things do not pull. Dying things do. They reach, without intending to, for whatever warmth is nearby. And if the nearby warmth is the particular kind that knows how to pour itself into things that need it, the living soul begins to drain. He had been eroding since before I was born. Before my grandmother was born. 400 years of ruling through force, of cutting every soft thing from himself because he had decided soft things were liabilities. 400 years of that particular project had left him hollow at the center in a way that not even he could see, because you cannot see your own hollow when it has been there long enough that you have built your whole architecture around it. I walked in with my crates and my soil amendments and my 12 years of knowing how to keep threshold-sensitive things alive. My soul looked at his and recognized the pattern. I was saving him without knowing it. He was killing me without knowing it. I have turned that over many times in the long hours of lying here, trying to find something in it that I can be angry about cleanly. I have not managed it yet. The night that will not leave me is a Wednesday in late March, 3 a.m., the lake outside making its particular low sound against the retaining wall. Not waves, more like the water shifting its weight, restless in the way of things that have been still too long. I was on the greenhouse floor. Not because I had fallen. I had sat down deliberately, as I sometimes did in the worst hours, pressing my palm flat against the tile because the cold moved up through my hand and into my wrist and steadied the tremor in a way that nothing else did. The orchids were fully bloomed by then, 14 of them, their petals the color of bruised plums, their scent something between rain and something older than rain. The grow lights were cycling through the threshold sequence. The room held a dim, moving quality, light shifting by degrees. I heard nothing. The density changed. I kept my eyes on the nearest orchid. My hands stayed flat on the tile. I slowed my breathing, not because I was afraid, which is the part one cannot account for even now. I was not afraid. I was something else. Alert in the way you are alert to something you have been waiting for, without admitting you were waiting. He stood over me for 3 minutes. I counted. He did not speak. I did not move. He was looking at the orchids. I could feel the direction of his attention the way you feel a lamp turned toward you in a dark room. Not warmth, but the specific awareness of being within something's radius. Then he left. The air settled. The orchids did not move. I pressed my palm harder against the cold tile and stayed there until the tremor in my wrist eased, which took a long time. I told myself it was the cold that was steadying me. I did not ask myself why. For those 3 minutes, the tremor had stopped entirely. In the morning, he threw my newest graft into the hallway fire. I heard it before I saw it. The dry crackle of something too young and green to burn cleanly, the sound of the thing fighting the flame for a moment before the flame won. I came around the corner, and he was already walking away, his back to me, unhurried. He said, without turning, "You coddle weak things." I stood there looking at the ash on the hearthstone. The graft had taken 8 weeks to reach the stage I had brought it to. 8 weeks of precise calibration, of coaxing it along the threshold, of staying an extra hour each night to monitor the light cycle. I went back to the greenhouse and started a new one. That is not the part that stays with me. The part that stays with me is what I thought, standing at that hearthstone, looking at what was left. I thought. He came to look at the orchids in the dark. I should have been thinking about the graft.
I was thinking about that.
He came to look at the orchids in the dark. I had kept thinking it, even as the fever memories blurred, and the ceiling of the infirmary came back, that hairline crack, the cream plaster, the window with its thin winter light. The thought had followed me out of the past and into the present, where it sat with the particular weight of something unfinished. I did not know how long I had been here. The light suggested afternoon. My body suggested longer. The cold was the specific kind that lives below the skin. Not the cold of a room, not the cold of January air. Something interior, as though whatever generates warmth in a person had been turned down by degrees over such a long period that no one had noticed the room getting darker. I had been walking around in that cold for months. I had called it fatigue. I had called it stress. I had called it the particular toll of working in a place where nothing was safe and no one was kind. I had been wrong about what to call it. Reyes came in the way people come in when they have already rehearsed what they are going to say and are committed to finishing it. He was old in the way that certain vampires are old, not aged, exactly, but worn to something essential, the way a river stone is worn. He had served 3 kings. It showed in his economy of movement, his refusal to let silence pressure him into filling it. He sat in the chair beside the bed, and he looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who has delivered verdicts long enough that they no longer confuse compassion with delay. He said the old term first. Anima marcescens. Then, in plain language, soul wither. He explained what it was, what it does, the mechanism of it, the inadvertent bond, the slow transfer, the way a living soul positioned close enough to a dying one begins to take on the dying one's erosion, absorbing what the other cannot carry, until the living soul is carrying 2 weights with the resources of one. I lay still and listened. I did not cry. What I felt, it was not surprise. It was the specific sensation of a word being placed next to a thing you have been circling for months, and the 2 locking together with a sound so quiet you almost miss it. Recognition. Not relief. Not grief. The particular stillness of finally knowing the name of what has been sitting in the room with you. I had been grieving this for months. I had not known what I was grieving. Now I did. The room held a mechanical hum from somewhere behind the far wall. Heating system, pipes. Something functional and indifferent. I focused on it for a moment before I asked, "Does he know?" Reyes looked at me the way he must have looked at the previous 2 kings when they asked questions that revealed more than they intended to reveal. "Tristan," he said, with the particular precision of a man placing a name where it belongs, "has been gone for 6 days. He let that land. He was, I understood, a man who knew exactly how long to let things land. 6 days. The same night I collapsed." Reyes continued, in the same unhurried cadence. 3 diplomatic agreements, terminated. His intelligence network, the full reach of it, every operative deployed before dawn. The court had received 1 directive before Tristan vanished, delivered in the particular tone his court had learned to treat as non-negotiable. "Find the alchemist. Find the elixir. Bring it to me, or I will take apart every city between here and the coast." Reyes stood. He said something else about rest, about the court physician checking in tomorrow, about the orchids being tended. I heard the words. I could not tell you the order they came in. He left. The door did not make a sound closing. I lay very still. Outside the window, The lake was the color of a bruise, that particular late afternoon gray-blue that Lake Mendota goes in early spring, when the ice has been gone long enough that the water has lost its flatness, but not yet found its warmth. I watched it, and I thought about the seedling, the one he threw into the hallway fire. The 8 weeks I had put into it, the careful calibration, the extra hour each night. I thought about every morning I had pressed my palm against the greenhouse wall and counted my own breath, waiting for the world to level out. I thought about the sound of his footfall on the greenhouse floor, the particular weight of it, the specific interval between steps, the way I had learned it so precisely that I could tell, without turning, whether he was going to the east table or the west. I had learned it without deciding to. It had simply accumulated, the way useful information accumulates when you are paying attention to something and cannot admit why. I thought about the threshold light, how I had started leaving it on an extra hour each night, how I had told myself it was for the orchids. Tristan knew before I did. That is the part one keep returning to. Not the cruelty. The cruelty I had catalogued and filed. I was used to cruelty. I had a long relationship with it. Not the 6 days, not the burning cities, not the cost of it. The knowing that he had seen what was happening to me, seen it in his way, through whatever it is that 400 years of reading threats gives a man, and had said nothing. Had called me fragile. Had taken my seedlings and extinguished my candles and watched me brace myself against walls. He knew. He stayed silent. He broke things. Then I collapsed, and Tristan burned the world. I was furious. I also lay there aware that something in my chest, the place where the cold had been most constant, where the weight had been sitting longest, was 3 degrees warmer than it had been this morning. Those two things were both true, and I was too tired to work out what to do with them. The fury was clean. I understood it. 12 years of doing necessary work in rooms where no one acknowledged it, of keeping fragile things alive through sheer discipline, of being told that my particular kind of precision was really just anxiety dressed up, and then one man who could have simply asked what was wrong, who had seen it and known it, choosing cruelty over a single honest word. The other thing, the warmth, the fact that somewhere out there he was dismantling cities. I was not ready to examine that. Not yet. What I did, instead, was reach for the small notebook I kept in my coat pocket. My coat had been folded over the chair beside the bed. The notebook was where it always was. I opened it to the next blank page. I wrote, "The orchids are still alive. Someone should tend them." I did not write anything else. I closed the notebook. I put it back. I looked at the ceiling. The hairline crack. The cream plaster. The window with its bruised lake beyond. He still called me fragile. And somewhere in me, underneath the fury, underneath the cold, in the place I was not examining, something had been waiting, for a very long time, to be the thing someone burned cities for. I was not proud of that. It was true anyway. I was not proud of what the warmth meant. I had written it down, or rather, written around it, the orchids, the tending, the practical things, and closed the notebook and told myself that was enough for now. It was not enough. I knew that before the ink was dry. The thing about being a woman who has spent years doing necessary work in rooms where no one notices is that you develop a very specific relationship with wanting. You learn to keep it small. You learn to want only the things that are already within reach, a graft that takes, a root system that holds, a morning when your hands are steady and the light is right, and the work goes clean. You stop wanting the larger things because the larger things have a way of showing you, with devastating precision, exactly how much you are not considered. I had been good at small wanting for a long time. Lying in that infirmary bed, I was discovering that I had, without noticing, started wanting something I had not budgeted for. I put the notebook in my coat pocket. I looked at the ceiling. I waited for the feeling to pass. It did not pass. The wall to my left was not thick enough. I learned this on the second day, or what I understood to be the second day, time being unreliable in the particular way it is when your body has decided its primary business is survival rather than timekeeping. 2 courtiers in the corridor beyond, speaking in the compressed tones of people who believed they were being careful. They were not being careful. They had simply forgotten that the woman on the other side of the wall had spent months developing a heightened sensitivity to sounds in rooms she was not supposed to be monitoring. Milwaukee first. The underground court there. Old, established, the kind of institution that had operated beneath that city's foundations for 2 centuries and considered itself beyond the reach of any individual king's displeasure, had received Tristan on the third night. He had presented a demand. They had refused it, which was their right under the compact that governed relations between the regional courts. He had burned them to the waterline in 40 minutes. I lay still and listened to this. The courtier recounting it had the voice of someone who had been awake for days and was no longer certain which of his responses were appropriate to the situation. The other courtier said nothing for a long stretch. Then, very quietly, "Did anyone survive?" A pause. "He left them alive." A longer pause, the kind that carries its own meaning. Because that was the specific cruelty of it, not destruction for its own sake, but destruction as a message. He had not killed them. He had simply removed everything they had built and left them standing in the ash, so they could spend however many centuries remained to them contemplating the distance between what they had been and what they were now. I thought about the seedling, the fire in the hallway, the way he had walked away without watching it burn. Tristan had always known exactly how much to take. The archive vaults came next, cracked open on the fourth night, according to the dispatch Reyes received, which the courtiers were apparently not as discreet about discussing as they imagined. The vaults sat beneath the lake bed itself, accessible only through a passage that fewer than a dozen living creatures knew existed. Tristan had known. Of course he had known. He had been in this city since before it had a name. 3 archivists had tried to stop him. They were alive. Whatever he had taken from them in exchange for that, whatever particular cost he had extracted, the dispatch did not specify, and the courtier's voice went careful in a way that suggested the specifics were worse than useful to repeat. He had taken records. Old ones. The kind that document the movements of figures who do not wish to be documented. The alchemist had been located, or rather, a location had been identified, the remnants of one, a space in the Lake District's human fringe that still held the particular atmospheric residue of long-term alchemical work. She had moved. She always moved. She was not a creature who stayed anywhere long enough to be found by force, and every approach that relied on force would arrive one step behind her, perpetually, for as long as he chose to pursue her that way. The courtier's voice dropped lower here. He knows that now. The other one, does he? Not a question. I thought about standing at the edge of Lake Mendota in late November, which I had done, my first autumn in Madison, when the conservatory had given me a weekend and I had not known yet what to do with unstructured time. The water had been still in the specific way it goes still just before the cold locks it. The light had been nearly gone. And there had been a quality to standing there at the edge of something that vast and indifferent that I had never been able to name exactly. The awareness of witnessing a force that was operating entirely without reference to whether you were present or not. Not frightening. Not comforting. Something in between, something that required you to locate yourself very precisely in relation to it before you could decide how to feel. That was what I felt, lying there, piecing together what Tristan was doing from voices through a wall. Not gratitude. Not yet. The awareness of a force in motion. He had reached toward me the way the orchids had. That was the part one kept circling back to, the part one could not file away or document or reduce to something manageable. The orchids had not chosen to reach toward the threshold light. They had done it because that was their nature, because 400 years of evolution had made them the kind of thing that orients toward the precise quality of illumination that allows them to survive. They were not grateful for the light. They did not consider the light. They simply turned. I had spent my whole life learning to grow in low light. I had become, over years and necessity, a woman who knew how to keep going in conditions that were not designed for her. I had not thought of that as a quality anyone would value. I had thought of it as adaptation, as coping, as the particular form of endurance that develops when the alternative is not acceptable. I had not thought that somewhere out there, something was dying in the dark and turning toward me the same way. I had not thought that someone would burn entire cities trying to bring the light back to me. I was not ready to know what to do with that. The notebook was in my coat pocket. I had already written what I was willing to write. What I was not willing to write, I hope he finds her. What I did instead was reach for the coat, pull the notebook out, open it to the page I had already written on, and read those words again. The orchids are still alive. Someone should tend them. Practical.
Contained.
The kind of thing a woman writes when she is not yet ready to write the true thing. I closed it. I held it against my chest, over the place where the cold lived. Outside, the lake had gone dark. The corridor beyond the wall had gone quiet. Somewhere across the distance between here and wherever Tristan was, a man who had spent 4 centuries perfecting his cruelty was failing, repeatedly, to find something by force, because the thing he needed could not be taken. I held the notebook. I did not write anything else. The cold was still there. But the warmth underneath it was, inexplicably, still there too. I had no framework for holding both of those things at once. I held them anyway. The warmth and the cold had reached an arrangement. That is the only way I can describe what the next days felt like. Not recovery, not worsening, but a kind of negotiated stillness, as though the two things had agreed to coexist while they waited for something external to break the stalemate. I lay in the infirmary and I breathed and I watched the light change on the ceiling, and I did not write anything else in the notebook, because the notebook had become the place where I put things I was not ready to say aloud, and I had run out of room in that category. Everything I was carrying was too large for the margins I had been using. Reyes came once a day. He checked what needed checking, reported what he was permitted to report, and left. He had the gift, or perhaps the practice, of delivering information without attaching his own interpretation to it.
I came to rely on that.
The court's other physician had a manner I found harder to bear, full of the particular softness that people deploy when they have decided you are more fragile than you are and are trying not to damage you further. I was not fragile. I was cold and diminished and furious in layers, but I was not fragile, and being handled as though I were had always cost me more than honest bluntness. On the 9th day, Reyes came in and sat down and did not immediately speak. That was new. I waited. He said, "There has been movement." He told it without embellishment. The way a man tells a thing when he respects the person he is telling it to enough not to soften the edges. The alchemist had been tracked, not by force this time, not by networks or archive records or the kind of institutional pressure that had served Tristan for 4 centuries and had failed him repeatedly over the past week and a half. She had been found the way certain things can only be found, by arriving at every wrong answer first, eliminating them one by one, until what remained was the single possibility that brute certainty had kept obscuring. She was on the western edge of the Arboretum. The Arboretum, 900 acres of managed woodland on the southwest side of the city, where the old oaks have been standing long enough that their root systems run beneath the walking paths and buckle the pavement in places, and the city repairs it, and they buckle it again. I had walked those paths in my first year at the conservatory in the mornings before work because there is a particular quality to old-growth woodland in winter, the smell of it, cold soil and bark, and something underneath both of those, something fermentative and slow, that steadied me in a way the campus buildings did not. I had walked those paths and never found the house. Reyes said it was not on any map. He said it pressed between 2 oaks on the western boundary as though it had grown there, which, he implied, was not entirely figurative. He said Tristan had arrived at its door just before midnight on the 8th night. He paused here. The deliberate kind. She opened it before he knocked. I know the shape of what happened on that porch the way you know the shape of something you did not witness but have carried long enough that it has taken up residence in you. Not imagined. Exactly. More like received. The way old buildings receive the events that occurred inside them and hold the frequency of them in their walls. She had been waiting. Not for him, specifically. Reyes relayed this carefully, in the tone of a man repeating something verbatim, because the original phrasing mattered, but for the kind of man Tristan was. The kind who had spent centuries excising every soft thing from himself and had arrived, finally, at a porch in the dark, undone, because the one soft thing he had failed to reach had been quietly dying beside him while he perfected his contempt. She had the elixir. Her price was not material. Not a service, not an allegiance, not any of the currencies he had been spending freely for the past 9 days. Her price was a sentence. Spoken aloud. In his own voice. What the woman was to him. Not what she had contributed. Not what her absence would cost the orchids or the court or the diplomatic arrangements he had already incinerated. What she was to him, the specific, unguarded, interior truth of it, from a man who had not spoken an unguarded interior truth since somewhere in the 2nd century of his reign, when he had apparently decided that truth was a liability he could not afford and had set about making himself into someone who never needed it. Reyes stopped speaking. The room held the mechanical hum from the pipes. Somewhere outside, a branch moved against the window glass, a dry, intermittent sound, like someone tapping to be let in. I looked at the ceiling. I said, "Did he say it?" Reyes said, "I was not there." A pause. Then, because he was a man who had served 3 kings and had learned which omissions were kindnesses and which were cruelties, "The elixir is in transit." I closed my eyes. I thought about what it would cost a man like Tristan to say a true thing about himself. Not the political cost, I was past caring about that, but the interior cost. The specific violence of opening a door you have spent 4 centuries bricking shut, standing in the gap of it, and letting someone look through. I had done versions of that. Smaller versions, in smaller rooms, with lower stakes. I knew what it cost. I knew the particular way your voice sounds when you're saying the true thing, and your whole body is aware that you cannot take it back. Slightly too careful, slightly too still. The voice of someone walking a surface they're not certain will hold. He had stood on that porch. He had gone still in the way. He went still when he had chosen something. And he had said whatever he said, into the dark and the cold, and the smell of those old oaks, and the waiting face of a woman who had seen every version of this particular scene, and was unmoved by all of them. I did not know what the words were. I know when it happened. I was in the deepest part of the cold, the place I had been trying not to look at directly, where the warmth had stopped reaching and the distance between breathing and not breathing had narrowed to something I could feel the edges of. I had been lying very still for a long time. The ceiling was the same. The light was low. And then something opened. Not inside me. Somewhere else, far away, in the direction of the arboretum, in the direction of the dark and the oaks, and a porch I had never seen. A door at great distance. Not sound. Not warmth. The sensation of a seal breaking. The way a room changes when a window is opened in a house that has been shut for a long time. That particular shift in pressure, almost inaudible, the moment before the fresh air arrives. My hands, which had been still against the blanket, moved. Not a tremor. The opposite of a tremor. My fingers spread flat against the fabric the way they spread against the greenhouse soil, pressing down, feeling for something alive below the surface. The cold was still there. It was less than it had been. I lay with my palms flat and my eyes closed, and I did not try to name what had just reached across the distance between Tristan's mouth and my chest. I only knew that whatever he had said, whatever it had cost him to say it, some portion of it had arrived here. I was not ready for that to matter to me as much as it did.
It mattered anyway.
It mattered anyway. I lay with that through the rest of the night. Palms flat, eyes open, the ceiling unchanged above me, the cold diminished but present, and that sentence sitting in my chest like a stone that had been there so long it had started to feel like structure.
It mattered anyway.
I had built a careful life around not letting things matter that I could not control. I had been very disciplined about it. The discipline had served me in rooms where the alternative was being visibly broken by something I had no power over, and those rooms had been, if I was honest, most of the rooms I had occupied. The discipline had not, apparently, survived this. I did not sleep. The light came slowly, the specific gray pre-dawn that arrives over Lake Mendota in early spring, more a dilution of dark than an arrival of light, the window going from black to the color of old pewter. The kind of morning that does not announce itself. I heard him before anyone else did. Not footsteps. He did not make footsteps in the way that announced intention. I heard the quality of the corridor change, that particular density I had catalogued in January in the greenhouse doorway, the air pressing differently when something that old and that certain moved through a space. I heard 2 sets of courtier footsteps stand aside. I heard nothing after that, which was itself a sound. The door opened without a knock. He looked like a man who had crossed a distance that had nothing to do with miles. His coat was wrong, not damaged, but worn in the way fabric wears when it has been slept in, if he had slept, which I doubted. There was something at the edge of his jaw, the faintest shadow of someone who had not stopped to consider such things, and his hands, When he came in and set the small case on the table beside the bed, held a precise steadiness that I recognized as the steadiness of a person who is committed completely to not letting themselves come apart in front of another person. He sat in the chair. Reyes appeared in the doorway, 30 seconds behind him, with the expression of a man who had prepared for this contingency and was now assessing whether his preparation had been adequate. He said, "I can administer." Tristan looked at him. Reyes left. The elixir was the color of water in old glass, not colorless, but the particular near-clear of something that carries more than it appears to. He opened the case with the focused economy of someone who had been told the exact procedure and intended to follow it without error. His hands did not tremble. Neither did his expression. He said nothing. Neither did I. There is a specific quality to silence between two people who have too much to say and have both, independently, arrived at the conclusion that none of it can come first. I had been in silences before that were empty, the silences of people with nothing between them, which are really just the absence of sound. This was not that. This was the silence of compression, of two people in the same room with a year's worth of unexchanged truth and the wordless agreement to let the immediate thing happen before the larger reckoning began. He administered the elixir with the careful attention of a man who has decided that this, at least, he will do without error. Then he sat back. He did not leave. It worked the way winter ends, not in a single morning, but by degrees so gradual you cannot locate the exact moment when the cold became something other than permanent. An hour in, the gauze edge at the periphery of my vision began to thin. 2 hours, and the weight in my chest, the one I had been carrying so long it had stopped registering as weight and had become simply the way breathing felt, started to lift, slowly, the way a hand lifts from a surface when the pressure is no longer needed. My hands, when I moved them, were steady. Not careful steady, not the managed stillness of someone controlling a tremor. Steady the way they had been before all of this, before October, before the conservatory mornings when I had braced against the workbench and filed the problem away under a name that wasn't right. I lay there and I opened and closed my fingers. He watched. I looked at him properly for the first time. Not the peripheral awareness I had developed in the greenhouse, not the cataloging glances I had permitted myself when his back was turned.
Directly.
He looked like a man standing on the far side of something he had walked through and could not walk back through, and was only now beginning to understand the geography of where he stood. Not broken. Not soft. Something else. Something that did not have a word in any language I had been taught. I said, "The orchids." His voice, when it came, was careful in a way his voice had never been careful with me before. Still alive. I had them move to the south alcove. A pause. More threshold light. The silence after that was long enough to hold everything. Milwaukee. The archive vaults. 9 days and every burned bridge, and the particular cost of standing on a porch in the dark and opening a door he had bricked shut in the 2nd century of his reign. The seedling he threw into the hallway fire. Every candle he extinguished. Every morning I braced against the wall, and he watched and called it weakness. All of it in the room, not spoken, the weight of it distributed through the air between us like barometric pressure before a storm. I said, "You called me fragile." He did not look away. He had, whatever else he was, never been a man who looked away. "I know what I called you." Not an apology. He was not a man built for apologies, and a false one would have been worse than silence, and he knew that, and I knew that, and the fact that we both knew it was itself a kind of honesty. I looked at him for a long time. I was not ready to forgive him. I was not sure forgiveness was even the right architecture for what came next. Forgiveness implies a transaction, a debt acknowledged and released, and what existed between us was not a transaction. It was a reckoning. Two people on either side of everything that had happened, looking at each other across the distance of it, deciding separately whether the distance was crossable and what crossing it would require. I was alive. He was broken open. Those two facts occupied the same room. In the space between them, something was possible that had not been possible before. I did not know its shape yet. I only knew it was there. I said, "My orchid journal. It's in the greenhouse, east table, brown cover." He stood without a word. He was gone for 4 minutes. I counted, an old habit, and when he came back he set it on the bed beside my hand and returned to the chair without being asked. I opened it to the first blank page. My hands were steady. The light through the window had gone from pewter to the particular thin gold of early morning, the threshold hour, the light neither fully arrived nor still departing. The same light the orchids required. The same light I had spent my whole life learning to work in. I wrote the date. Then beneath it, in the same hand I had always used for things I intended to keep, Day 1. I did not show him what I had written. He did not ask. He stayed. If this reached something in you, the part that knows what it is to be called fragile by someone who needed your light more than they could admit, you're not alone in that. There are women here who have lived this in 100 different forms. Stories that know what that particular ache feels like. Subscribe so they keep finding you when you need them. This is the kind of place that's easy to lose and harder to find again.